Hello, hello, hello. Oh, that's not bad. Maybe a little loud. Yeah. Hello, hello, hello. Oh, yeah, that's much better, I think. Yeah. Yeah. I don't feel like I'm making your ears bleed or something like that. Yeah, exactly. Uh, wonderful. Well, I'll wait till you get seated. Nice. Well, okay, so let's sit for a while. That will be fun and necessary. So, I would say if you're partial to a cross-legged posture, which some people are and some people aren't, um, then the ones that the 13th century Zazen instructions recommend are full lotus or half lotus. So, just to go through this, I've talked about this before, but if you look at full lotus, the good news about it is that it means your knees are really close together relatively, and and the down pressure on your knees is quite even, so it really feels solid. And not everybody can sit in full lotus, but if you ever get to a point where it's possible, it's actually tremendously beneficial. It's quite good, and can be surprisingly comfortable for long periods of sitting. I mean, again, mainly because it's so well balanced that it's less likely that you're going to get a discomfort in one or the other hip or one or the other psoas muscles or something like that. Right? So anyway, but that said, half lotus, which canonically is pressing your left foot against your right thigh, it's quite similar and almost as good. It's a little bit less balanced, and it's good. And if you're sitting in a posture that's either half lotus or maybe you're sort of sitting in Burmese posture, right? It's worth noticing the if there's any twist in there. So you move yourself right and left and see if you can find a sort of midpoint where the slight stresses on the muscles, your upper quads and your psoas muscles and so on, are kind of balanced out. It's definitely worth finding that. Again, and if you're sitting in Seiza, which a couple of you are, the request is more or less the same. You want to have the down pressure on your knees and lower legs be relatively even, and feel like there's a tripod of support that includes your knees and your sit bones, essentially, that's holding you up, right? And feels pretty solid. The Let me get back into half lotus here. As a side note, I've started sitting non-canonical half lotus with my right foot pressed against my left thigh, which is not in the 13th century Zazen instructions. But it turns out that it's really useful because essentially, if you sit the same way half lotus for a year, it slowly produces a kind of unbalanced. And so it's going to just switch it around, basically, right? I've noticed that, having picked this up a month or so ago and started using it, I noticed that my Zazen posture and half lotus in general is more comfortable, which is nice, actually. So anyway, make sure you're kind of centrally situated with respect to the twist in your upper body with respect to your lower body, and similarly the tilt of your pelvis. If you tilt your pelvis forward, you'll notice after a while when you really push it, you get a bit of a pinch in your lower back. You tilt it the other way, your lower back starts to bow, and there's some stress along here. So find a spot that balances those out, and that's your sort of sweet spot for the tilt of your pelvis. And that's pretty important, actually. If you for one reason or another, usually this comes from being in a hurry to sit down, or maybe pushing a little too hard. But if you get in a position where you've got your pelvic tilt wrong, you can. One of the things that can happen if your pelvis is tilted too far back, oddly, it can show up as pain down here at your knee joints, because there's a pull on the connective tissue to your knees, and after 20 minutes to a half an hour, it actually starts to hurt, particularly if you're sitting in retreat or something like that. So anyway, something like that. And then, having done all that, the way I like to think of it is, if you locate your hara, which is this spot that's kind of in the middle of your body, a couple inches below your navel, it's the bottom of your breathing apparatus, right? If you locate your hara, you can imagine a pillar planted in your hara that's supporting your sternum. So it does this thing where, if you just do that kind of subtle lift, you can feel it. It substantially relaxes the muscles in your upper back and your shoulders, and it can almost feel, if you do it sort of suddenly, it can almost feel like the skin on the back of your neck and between your shoulder blades is kind of crawling or sagging down your back toward the base of your spine, right? And your posture naturally straightens out. Your chest opens a little bit, and that in the long run makes more room for air, air is an extremely good thing. So on top of that, let your head float up off your shoulders, up and back. Your face naturally falls into a vertical plane with your nose above your navel, right? And when your chest opens like this, your shoulders the energy in your shoulders is kind of out and down, and the hand posture that goes along with that, if you want to do it, is put your left palm on top of your right palm, bend everything around into a big circle with contact between your fingers and your thumbs, light and sort of energetic, right? Place that here in a way that kind of emphasizes your hara, with your thumb tips at or above, slightly above your navel, and everything else sort of hanging below that. Open your eyes, let the gaze fall in front of you, soft gaze, but relaxed and wide. So you can really take in the periphery. Not looking at anything, just bringing it in. Mouth closed, teeth and lips both shut, tongue gently pressed against the front roof of your mouth. Try bringing a little bit of tension to your hara, just a little bit of slight tightening of your lower stomach muscles and maybe the muscles of your pelvic floor, like your perineal muscles. And let the breath fall completely out of the body. And then when it's pretty much gone, just pause and notice how little is actually happening in this moment, or how much. And then when your diaphragm says it's time to breathe in, just let go of any tension. Keep your attention down here in your hara and let the breath just flow in and fill the body. If you like, you can imagine that on the out breath, the breath falls from the upper chest past your solar plexus into your hara, sort of down the front of the body. And then on the in-breath, it floods in through from your hara, up your spine, comes around and lands here, in between your eyes, in the middle of your forehead. So do that for some number of breaths, 3, 5, maybe even 7. And then when you've settled with that, just let your breath take its natural depth and rate. But keep your attention in your hara, keep your attention kind of on the activity of breath and see what happens. Okay, I'm going to ring this bell. The ancient instructions for sitting say this peculiar thing. They say, think not thinking. How do you think not thinking? Non-thinking. And that's really all they say about it. But we can unpack that a bit just in the process of sitting. Obviously, because we're human, thoughts will arise, and some of those thoughts will have enough intrigue or compelling power to snatch our attention away from the connection with the body and the breath and the environment, and pull it into a sort of narrower focus on the thought and the emotions that arise around that thought. That's just how it works. That's how we're built. But that's not the whole story, right? Our ruminative, cognitive, self-narrative faculty has a pretty obvious time-sharing relationship set up with our broadly attentive, unloaded, kind of selfless faculty, right? And the two perform these kind of natural trade-offs. And the only problem with it is that we're habituated to, once a thought comes up and we're cranking away on it, it's harder to notice that our body and our sensory apparatus are inviting us to pay attention to what's going on in the world. So one of the functions of this practice is to start to notice those invitations and to accept them. And that's kind of what is meant in the ancient instructions by non-thinking. It's pretty much a straightforward acknowledgement that thoughts are going to arise, but they needn't be the primary focus of our attention, or at least not all the time. And they can be surrounded by a broader picture of the moment and the experience of being this human in it, right? That includes this sort of mode of broad, receptive, unloaded, selfless attention. So see if you can notice what happens when you're thinking and a sensation arises and briefly draws your attention, or maybe you just spontaneously become aware that you're sitting here in the middle of this room with the sounds and play of light and the sensations and kind of functioning of the body, right? See if you can allow that invitation to be attentive to sink in and to softly settle whatever it was you were thinking about without trying to banish it or push it out of the way. Just let it settle on of its own accord. And if it doesn't, it's okay. Then there'll be another invitation in the next 10 seconds. I guarantee it. Mm. guess the question is, I said a bunch of stuff there about sitting practice and so on. Are there any questions about any of that, or any questions or comments about your own practice, how it feels, what works and what doesn't, any stuff like that, as long as before we kind of move on into other stuff? Any thoughts?
I'm really glad you pointed out the positioning of the backbone and the different things that you did, because I lasted a lot longer than I thought it was going to.
Oh, is that right? Nice. That's awesome. That's great. Yeah, I mean, it's there's a bunch of different ways to sit, right? And the back in the day when this guy Dogen, who brought Zen to Japan, was figuring out how to write the instructions, he actually copied them from a Chinese guy that had written a similar set, I don't know, in the previous century or so. But the overall request, the sort of meta point, is to have a posture that's relaxed and comfortable and sort of energetic, right? And however you can do that, it is fine. And over time, as Zen practice has moved around various places in the world, people have tried out different stuff with that same sort of goal is not exactly the right word, but that seems a rubric in mind, right? So relaxed and energetic. So you should be upright largely because of a light engagement of the large muscles in your body, and not because you're yanking yourself one way or another, right? And your body naturally takes that shape. Some people, to do these cross-legged postures, and maybe even to a certain extent to do seiza, also makes some requirements of your hips and knees, right? And those sometimes can be difficult to meet. Like in order to really be comfortable doing half lotus or full lotus, you have to have a amount of twist in your hips that people who spend a lot of time sitting in chairs don't really develop that easily, right? You can do it over the course of a lifetime of sitting, but it's a process, right? And so I'd say, mainly find a position that allows you to have that feeling of being relaxed and energized, and then take it. And over time, the yoga of it is to bring yourself up next to the sort of right near the limit of your physical capacity, and neither flee from it or like try and muscle through it, right? But to live there, kind of with this sort of curiosity and gentleness or something like that. And over time, that's what transforms your body and makes it more possible to do, basically, something like that. But yeah, it's a good question. Have you ever tried sitting zazen in a chair? In a chair? Yeah, but I mean, have you ever tried like trying to meditate in a chair, right? Yeah, okay. Because I mean, that's also that's I spent years teaching at the Tom Waddell Clinic in the Tenderloin in San Francisco, right? And when I was getting set up to do it, the very good old friend of mine was the head of psychiatric services there, and she's the person that sort of invited me to do it, right? So, I made this plan, and I had a bunch of sort of sitting materials like this, and at home, because I'd collected them over the course of years of doing this. And I was like, okay, so I'll bring in some zabatons and some zafus, and we'll set things up and people can sit. And she's like, no, none of that, right? Because it's a clinic that that treats a lot of people that walk in off the street, and the staff and administration are just completely phobic about insects, right? And because there's a lot things you get, bed bug infections or other things like that. It's quite difficult to keep the bugs out. And when the thing they've noticed that makes the bugs most comfortable is soft, cushy things. So no soft, cushy things could enter this space. And so we did all our sitting in these kind of really cheap cast plastic versions of the Eames chair, essentially, right? And it was great. It was really, really good. You can sit tremendously comfortably in a chair and still have this kind of alertness and engagement that's kind of the ideal for Zazen practice or something. So anyway, yeah. Yeah. Any other questions or comments? Or yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, I really liked the breath work that we did right at the
Yeah,
beginning.
yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
And I noticed that about halfway through, I sort of needed to do some version of that to refresh the energy level.
Yeah, that's exactly right.
Okay.
Yeah. I mean, it's a technique that you can use to sort of. I mean, so again, the instructions just say take 3 or 4 deep, or I think 3 deep breaths, but that's what they're talking about, right? Right? And they say it at the beginning, but it really is true that if in the middle you're feeling, kind of either distracted, or you notice that your posture has sort of slipped out of alignment and things are uncomfortable or something like that, it's tremendously useful to be able to kind of re-engage with that breath. And I mean, if you do yoga, you'll kind of recognize the particulars of that breathing methodology. It's essentially yogic. It's a soft version of yogic Ujjayi breathing without the throat lock. It's just using the whatever they call these locks down here. I forget, like the Mula Bandha and Yada Bandha or something like that, right? But the idea is that you just use, and this is particular, I think, to the yogic approach of Zazen. You just use your hara and your sort of the muscles in your pelvic floor as a focus, and kind of as the focus in general of the meditation. And that focus can be reinvigorated by doing some of this breathing. Yeah, absolutely. And it's completely fine to do that. In fact, people do it all the time. And I guess the other thing about Zazen, the term that gets kicked around, and it's or phrase that gets kicked around, both in Chinese and Japanese, although they're obviously pronounced differently in Chinese and Japanese. And it was a phrase that Dogen, this guy I was talking about, his teacher, whose name was Tiantong Rijing, who lived at a monastery kind of near the coast, where I don't know if you know where Ningbo is in China, but there's a little pocket-sized mountain range near there, and there's a monastery there where Dogen went to study with this guy who was really a Zen master, right? I mean, he was great, and he taught him this term, and the term is, in Japanese, it's shikantaza, right? And I forget how to pronounce it in Chinese, and my Chinese pronunciation is terrible anyway. But it's usually translated in English as just sitting, and that's almost correct. But it's shikantaza is 4 characters, and they're really weird. One of them is only, pipe, and hit, and sit. Okay. But it turns out that they form 2 compounds in Chinese. And this one over here, the only pipe, it's kind of super evocative. It's like it sort of it means this sort of, it has a sense of like laser focus or something like that, right? Like and so you want to be, like laser focused. And the other 2, hit and sit. Hit, the character that's translated, if by itself translated as hit, is combined with a lot of things to mean like it really is like strike a pose, basically, right? And so the idea is you strike the sitting pose single-mindedly, right? And you do it for however long you're sitting, right? And so things that help with that are 1, awareness of the body, and 2, awareness of and this yogic working with the breath. So yeah, absolutely, that's right. Yeah. Yeah, I spent a lot of time fiddling with that, because the first time I saw those characters, I was like, what are they talking about? But it turns out it actually makes tons of sense. So anyway, anything else?
Those were both perfect questions.
Awesome.
Not sold on practicing. During the sit, I sat. I wanted to move. I felt that was much more energetic, uncomfortable, and I could sit with it, and I could try to make some space for it. And at some point, I chose, out of weakness, to make myself comfortable. And so I've heard that sitting is blameless, that doing all sorts of other things are much more likely to cause suffering. But sitting, at least in the sort of on the learning curve, hurts.
Yeah.
So what's the point?
Yeah. Well, I mean, so great question, and it's kind of sort of a crucial question, right? Yes. I mean, and it goes back a little bit to the thing I was talking about earlier. Yes, sitting honestly is uncomfortable for everybody. It's, your body, right? You have this massive process that's running in your body that's about keeping your body in sort of allostatic comfort. You want to have the strain on your various muscles and pressure on your various joints be sort of balanced out, and you don't want to be like sit with one muscle tight for a really long time, and so on and so forth. And the process whereby we maintain this allostasis, it's this very complicated feedback loop between the mind and the body, and it happens just at the fringes of our awareness, but among the signals that our body generates in order to help us pay attention to that process is discomfort, right? And so if you sit in I almost guarantee it that if you sit in a single unmodified posture for an hour, something is going to get uncomfortable. Right? And so but none of that is an absolute, right? And so the request is this, and in some ways the point is this, right? You take a posture and you make your best effort to take a posture that's, like I said, kind of lively and comfortable and unlikely to, as unlikely as possible to get really uncomfortable. But again, we probably can't avoid it. And then you sit there for a while, and then something starts to show up, right? So the request is to pay attention to it, to see if some insight arises about, and it doesn't always, but sometimes it does, about how you can modify your posture to make yourself more comfortable. And then you learn from that. And if you discover that somewhere in the middle of that, you're like, nah, this is just really uncomfortable. And I think if I change my posture in some obvious way, it'll feel better, then just do it. It's not, there's nothing that says you have to sit in excruciating pain for hour upon hour. There's a dynamic relationship between the mind and the body in all contexts, but certainly in the context of Zazen. And in Zazen, you have a unique opportunity to exploit that, because that's really all that's going on is the observation of that dynamic. And you really don't want to be sitting there going, oh my God, this hurts. Oh my God, this hurts. Oh my God, this hurts. That's not helpful for anybody, right? So yeah, absolutely. There is a kind of, traditionally, a kind of injunction in sitting Zazen that you not move, right? But I think everyone's pretty clear that that's kind of a false dichotomy. You're always moving when you're sitting, right? You're subtly, but nonetheless, you're always moving. So move enough so that you can make yourself comfortable. Does that help or make sense? Or yeah.
Dialogue.
Yes, please. Yeah, of course. Yeah.
So the phrase that hovered over this, somebody calls Zazen the balance state. And you said there's this process in our life that is trying to find allostatic balance.
Yeah, exactly. That's right.
So now I'm getting from what you said that in sitting, that's actually front and center.
Yes.
That you observe that maybe it's a mental posture that aligns with, okay, there's this, but it's not the whole world isn't the part that hurts.
Yeah.
So there's tolerance that comes with practice. You can actually dilute or somehow hold,
exactly. That's right. Discomfort.
Hold the discomfort. And then there's the insight that's like, oh, actually, I can align to it.
That's right.
So those are two ways of when it throbs. To find something in there, or just to be with that and let that work me.
Exactly. That's right. And then I would say the underlying kind of baseline of that whole process is a kind of self-compassionate or compassionate curiosity, or to be curious about what's going on with your body and its constant quest for allostatic balance, right? Yeah, exactly. That's right. What time is it? Okay. Well, I might have time to talk about this a little bit. So I'm curious. I'm currently teaching a class about this document called in Japanese, it's called the Sandokai. Right? And the title is pretty hard to translate, but it's usually translated as something like merging of difference and unity, or singularity and diversity, or there's a bunch of different ways of translating it, right? But it's one of a bunch of, I've started to discover and study these things now, of a bunch of sort of manifestos of the Zen school, dating back to way before there was actually a Zen school at all, right? So the the Zen school, the way we understand it now, was mostly cooked up at the end of the Tang Dynasty and in the first part of the Song Dynasty, and that's when they really started calling it the Zen school, right? But these documents date back hundreds of years before that, and they really read like a manifesto. They have the general structure is why you should be listening to this. One, here's some Dharma points. Here's some ways that you could be confused, so be careful with that. And go practice. And there's a bunch of them, and they really all kind of are like that. A lot of them are written as poems, but Dogen wrote a few. The guy I was talking about wrote a couple that are not written as poems. They're written as Dharma talks, and one of them is actually a fake Dharma talk that has a fake Q&A session at the end, where he like remembered all these like questions and complaints and comments and all this disparagement that he got from talking to the Buddhist establishment in Kyoto when he came back from studying in Japan, in China, and he boiled it down into, I don't know, some 10, 15 questions, and then just gives these snarky, like dismissive answers to them, right? But good answers, right? But in any case, so that's a sort of long form manifesto. But most of them are kind of like this, right? And so in this course that I've been teaching, it's an online Zen Center class, and it's not an online Zen Center, San Francisco Zen Center class about a very obscure document originally written in Chinese, kind of way back at the early beginnings of the Tang Dynasty. Does not get a lot of people to sign up, right? Even though it's actually part of the regular Zen Center liturgy. But I'm assigning everybody the task of writing a Zen manifesto of their own, and I have to write one too. So I haven't really gotten anywhere with it yet. So I was thinking about I would try and kind of take a first pass at a Zen manifesto. So here goes basically. So for as long as we've had any, and I've said a bunch of this stuff in other talks in this, and so if I'm repeating myself, please forgive me. But if you looking back in human history, and in particular the written record of what humans have been thinking for the last 4,000 years or so, a couple of things stand out. One, they're thinking a lot about stuff, right? But there's also a thread, which is to say, riches and so on. But there's also a thread, and a pretty powerful and persistent thread that lasts right up to this day, which is thinking about the problem, the following problem, right? Like, humans are really kind of messed up, and they're constantly making a mess of things and suffering, and and kind of acting like jerks to each other and to themselves, etc. Right? the introduction to the Odyssey has a conversation between Athena and Zeus where Zeus says, these humans, they're such a pain. We give them free will, and then they blame us, the gods, for everything. And I think we should just kill them all and start over again, right? And Athena goes, oh no, they're not so bad, and they have an argument about it, and so on and so forth. But I mean, it's really, and the Epic of Gilgamesh, very early document that has a mythological exploration of this whole question, has this great moment where Gilgamesh literally goes into a bar and he's talking with the bartender, who's this woman, about how about what he's doing, and she's like, Gilgamesh, give it a rest, okay? Just go home, relax, have a nice life. And he goes, no, I have to go off and do this thing, and he goes off and is terrible, right? He messes everything up and he kills like his best friend or something like that, and it's really kind of awful, right? So, and if you look at the way that mythological thread has kind of developed over time, right? So by the time you get here in so we're now in the, let's be clear, in the 21st century, but in the late 20th century, a lot of the exploration of that question was the province of science fiction, right? So the question of what it is to be human, and often it was the exploration was accomplished by standing up humans against either utterly non-human, like aliens, or else the superhuman, and so there are a few examples of that, like some Blade Runner, right? You have this really, really, cliche human guy, and although interestingly, in some interpretations, he's actually a replicant, but standing up against these like just unbelievably capable beings that are sort of human, right? That are fundamentally superhuman. And similarly in Star Trek, like one of the really great examples is both in the original series and in the movies that came substantially later, there's this setup where you have Captain Kirk, right? And then you have Spock, who's superhuman in this way that's kind of like the Enlightenment ideal of superhuman, or maybe the Stoic ideal of superhuman, right? It's like he's human-ish, but he manages to transcend it by essentially through practice and through a kind of leaning heavily into rationality and logic, right? That was kind of the Enlightenment ideal, I think, in some ways, and like I said, also the Stoic ideal. And then you have this other guy, Khan, who's superhuman just in the fact that he's really, really human, and he's really like hundreds of times better than everybody else at all the things that humans can do, right? So he's really smart. He's really strong. His capacity for long range planning and solving complex problems is way better than most humans, and so on and so forth. But he's also like just outrageously emotional and kind of a jerk in the largest possible frame, right? And there's two versions of him. There's the Ricardo Montalban version in the original series, and then in the movie, he was played by Benedict Cumberbatch. Did anybody see this movie? I mean, it's an amazingly good movie about exactly this problem, right? You have this guy, Kirk, who's, just this. He's like, he is the human, right? And then there are these two characters that are superhuman in these two different ways, and they sort of play off against each other, right? And it's good as an exploration of exactly that, right? But in addition to exploring it in a literary framework, there are also a bunch of philosophical systems that arose around it, and religious, systems and so on. And they all sort of grew up roughly around the same time, right? So in the last, 5 or 6 centuries before the Common Era, it was clearly a really big deal, and so you have Taoism, Confucianism, Jainism, Buddhism, the Yoga Sutra, and all that stuff, and in the West, pre-Socratic philosophy, and also the compilation of the Bible. Right? All that stuff was all intended to address, in some ways, this problem, right? And the thing that's kind of surprising and unique about the Buddhist explanation and solution is that it's, a lot of the explanations and solutions posited, inimical or at least problematic spirit beings, or very elaborate codes of conduct, and so on and so forth. Buddhism and Taoism have a slightly different flavor, but they leaned into something different. And and basically, in both cases, but especially I think in Buddhism, if you really dig into it, what you discover is that what the various Buddhist literatures, nobody really knows what happened, back in the day, right? But what the various Buddhist literatures that grew out of that say is that fundamentally we're messed up because of a misapplication of our human gifts, basically, right? Like we're what are we good at? As I was talking about this a little earlier, right? So we're good at language, and in particular, well, we're good at language. We have a really remarkably rich, grammatically rich, and semantically rich linguistic capacity that we can grow and shrink depending on the needs of the moment, and so on and so forth. It's amazing. It's really good, right? And we discover usually by age 2 that we can not only use it on other people, we can use it on ourselves as a kind of methodology for framing the moment, and for framing the self in that moment, and kind of figuring out what to do next, right? And furthermore, commenting on and adjusting our view of that as well, and adjusting our view of our past, right? So it becomes a very rich process, starting at, like I said, I think my daughter, when I was talking with her, my oldest daughter, when I was talking with her on the phone when she was, kind of like 2, at one point she said, Dad, I just figured out that I can talk to myself without talking out loud. So from there, right up to the time you're 12, you develop this very elaborate self-narrative, and it's undergirded by these powerful emotional tags that come along with it, right? That when you posit a piece of the narrative and it feels bad, you're like, bad. When you posit a piece of narrative that looks good, you feel, warm and fuzzy inside, right? And so that's tremendously powerful, and it's entangled with our capacity for long range planning, which we're also kind of good at. We're good enough at it to, write poetry, build large buildings and bridges, write software, I don't know, et cetera, right? All of that stuff, which is great. But we're not super good at it. And we're constantly kind of getting it wrong, right? But in any case, our self-narrative capacity is completely tangled up with our planning capacity, right? And then the last thing that's the great gift of physiological and cultural evolution to humans is our sociality, which is very rich and multi-layered, and there are a lot of other social animals, but humans have this thing where you can use the same emotional weights that you use to feel good about or feel bad about people in your immediate orbit to apply to vast groups of people the size of political parties or even whole nations, right? It's like that's weird. Like no other animal on the earth, as far as we know, has a sociality that's that complicated, right? And so those are the things, and they've enabled us to, for better or for worse, mostly for worse, take over the world. Right? But at the same time, their misapplication is the primary cause of human suffering and mess-making, basically. There's some other secondary parts, like we're just guaranteed to make mistakes because our scope and the scope of our view of the world is so limited compared to what's actually going on out there, right? That we can barely understand it at all. And our best efforts to understand it are janky at best, right? So there's some of that as well. But if it was just that, if it was just our limited view, we'd just be like, I don't know, but everything's okay, and let's have dinner, something like that. But unfortunately, we're not like that. We have this. We also are constantly imagining ideals and or averting from things that feel awful, and our quote gifts are a direct setup for human conflict at all scales of our sociality, all from families and friends all the way up to nation states, right? Which, as we all know, is a real mess. Right? So that's why it's worth exploring the Buddhist explanation and proposed solution to the problem of the human condition, because actually it makes a really intriguing offer that at least in principle might not be too hard to get a hold of, right? So, in the original, what's it called, the Dhammacakka Pavatana or something like that. I think that might be right. So where the Buddha first explains all this, he says, well, life is suffering. Suffering arises more, he actually just says initially it arises from clinging. And he gives two examples of clinging. One, clinging to life, and two, clinging to pleasure, right? But if you dig out the stuff that's lying under that in the Pali Canon and the Mahayana Canon, it's a lot more complex and mostly, sort of what I just said, right? And then he says, and there's this way you can solve it, which he lays it out as an eightfold path, but it's really got three top level bullet points. One is wise up, two is adjust your life so it promotes more wising up, and three is kind of meditate, right? And that's it, right? And that sounds pretty straightforward. People have elaborated on that a lot. By the time you get to the kind of end of the imperial era in Japan, where Dogen lived, he basically says, here's how it works. You study the self, right? And by study the self, he literally means the sit zazen and be a direct participant in and observer of the arising of the self in the world, in the co-arising of the self in the world, basically. And he says, when you do that, it's usually translated, when you do that, you forget the self, right? Which is kind of okay, but it's more like this. Eventually, after some practice, it becomes clear that there's more going on than we'd originally thought, right? And that we spend, as I was saying earlier, we spend a lot of especially our early lives, developing this self-narrative and this sort of model for the self and model for the world, and getting more and more skilled at placing that model for the self in our model for the world, and animating it in a way that allows us to, go down to the store and buy candy, or go get a degree in computer science and become an engineer, or whatever, right? And that's fine. And people live whole lives without really recognizing that there's more going on. But if you study it carefully, you start to see that actually there's a whole like container for that, a kind of mode of being that actually doesn't really care so much about the self and the world as an other, right? And relates to everything in a way that's much more straightforward and unloaded, and for which the kind of underlying baseline is a kind of comfort and delight in the mere act of being alive, basically. So it has it has the function of a counterweight against the emotional constructs that we carry in our cognitive faculty, basically, right? And then some other stuff happens, right? But so, okay. So what Dogen says is, he says, study the self. To study the self is to forget the self, and to forget the self is to be awakened by everything. So, in other words, everything that comes through over the transom and meets the body and mind, it presents an opportunity to be wide awake, right? And then he says, and that lasts basically forever. So that's the proposition, right? The problem is this is the part where the manifesto talks about how it's possible to get confused, right? The problem is that because we're human, we entangle all of our these human activities around measurement, judgment, and so on and so forth, with everything that we do, including our practice of zazen, right? So it's easy to get confused about what it means to actually do this practice, and so, the Suzuki Roshi, the guy that founded San Francisco Zen Center, the preface of his most famous book basically says exactly this. He says, everyone says it's hard to sit, it's hard to practice Zen, but nobody really is clear on why. The reason why is not because it's hard to sit Zazen. You can always figure out a way to do that, right? It's not even hard to kind of have these experiences that people usually characterize as enlightenment, right? There, where essentially you see a broader picture of what it is to be human than you'd originally thought, right? What's hard is to keep your practice from becoming totally gummed up with the aspects of the human condition that cause us to suffer. Right? It can be just another form of measurement, just another form of judgment, just another form of suffering. Right? And so that's the thing to be aware of in the context of practice, is that, so his solution in Zen Mind, Beginner's Mind, this book, his most famous book, is you just pretend you're doing it for the first time every time, right? Which is okay, right? It's really okay. It's a good approach, right? And also be, as I was saying earlier, be curious and self-compassionate. And when you notice yourself in the middle of measurement, judgment, condemnation, grasping after something different, so on, and all that sort of stuff, be gentle with yourself. Just know that that's exactly what it means to be human, right? And it has to be okay. You just have to have a way of meeting it and holding it so that it's not kind of a problem, right? So everybody should do it. Okay, that's my manifesto. And it's exactly 8:31. So thank you so much. I really appreciate it. Yeah. Now I have to write that down and submit it to my class.
We recorded it.
Right.
Yeah, I can transcribe it.
Oh yeah, go for it.
So a couple of things to tell you folks. One is that I believe that, I could be wrong because I sit with Michael Taft a lot, but I think that's the first Dharma talk about Star Trek that I have heard. I could be wrong. Yeah. You still owe us a Dharma talk about Taylor Swift, though. I'm going to hold you to that. But I want you all to know, and you all on the internet to know also, Zachary will be here next Monday and then is taking a summer sabbatical and will be back in mid-August. Early August. Yeah. So I'm saying that into the microphone so that the people on the internet know. We'll be here next Monday, and then there won't be a stream until early August. And if you're not subscribed to the newsletter, do that, because the exact dates will go out in next Monday's newsletter. Zachary is taking some time over the summer, so is Chandra. And there are a few other sort of summer gaps. L'Oreal, we're going to miss L'Oreal in August, but everyone's back by the fall. So all of that will be in the newsletter next week. And there's a bunch of stuff coming up. so much that it's hard to even like think of what to tell you all. So I'll tell you about Tram Day. Do you guys know about Bicycle Day? No. Yes. Yes, some people do, some people don't. So Bicycle Day is a psychedelic holiday. Albert Hoffman, who synthesized LSD, took LSD for the first time on purpose on April 19th, which is now commemorated as Bicycle Day, and he rode his bicycle home. And most people don't know that there was a woman on a bicycle right next to him when he was on that bike ride. She was his lab assistant. Her name was Susie Ramstein. And on that day, she became the first LSD guide, of which there are now many, right? Hmm. And then on June 12th of that same year, she became the first woman to take LSD. And somewhat more sensibly, she rode the tram. And so June 12th is Tram Day, and we are celebrating that here with the Women's Visionary Council. There's going to be a stream, so you can join on the stream. We thought about renting a tram, and then we decided that like 85 psychedelic people and a tram was probably not a good idea. So we might do that next year. But this year we're going to take an imaginal tram journey. And we'll have Suzanne Seiler here from Zurich, who's the world expert on Susie Ramstein. She like went into the archives and found out everything about her, and she's flying from Zurich to talk to us about Susie and about her life. So that is not this Wednesday, but next Wednesday. So hope to see you there, either in person or online. And we're looking forward to seeing you on Monday, Zachary, and then not again for a while. We'll miss you.